Salve! Let's learn about a purpose clause. You are studying Latin to explain your world. In English, a purpose clause looks like an infinitive. In the sentence, Quintus goes to Delphi to see the famous temple of Apollo, what I'm really saying is Quintus goes to Delphi in order that he may see the famous temple of Apollo. Or I could shorten it a little bit more. Quintus goes to Delphi in order to see the famous temple of Apollo. Can you see that there is some uncertainty in this construction? There's no guarantee that Quintus is going to see the famous temple, but he is proceeding to Delphi in order that he may at some point see that famous temple. In Latin, we need to learn a formula to express a purpose clause. We're going to start with these little words, ut or ne. Ut, if the purpose clause is positive. Ne, if the purpose clause is negative. Plus a present or imperfect subjunctive. How do you know which one to use? Always check the main verb. If the main verb is primary, which means if the main verb is present, future, or imperative, use the present subjunctive after the ut or ne in the purpose clause. In English, this corresponds to the helping verb may. If the main verb is secondary, which is to say past tense, then you will use imperfect subjunctive after the ut or ne. The imperfect subjunctive can be translated using the English helping verb might. So may is present, might is past tense. Both of these purpose clauses can be translated by means of an infinitive in English, as we saw on the earlier slide. Imperfect subjunctive, you say? This is my all-time favorite Latin verb form because it is facilima, very, 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 very easy. Take the present active infinitive, also known as the second principal part, the one that usually ends in re, and then add the personal endings, mst, mustis und, for active, or passive endings, the same ones that we've been using, aristur, more, mini, and tour. So for pattern verbs, I take the infinitive, the second principal part, and add the personal endings. Pararem, parares, pararet, pararemus, pararetus, pararent, etc. In the passive, pararer, it looks really weird, parareris, pararetur, pararemur, pararemini, pararentur. And you do that for each conjugation. If you see an infinitive inside a verb, any verb, that verb is an imperfect subjunctive, even if it's an irregular verb. So here's the imperfect subjunctive of sum. Take the infinitive, add the personal endings, assem, asses, asset, assemus, assetus, assent. If you can see an infinitive inside any verb, you have an imperfect subjunctive form. It doesn't matter how irregular the verb is. Even for wolo, wella, take the infinitive, add a personal ending. So really, every single verb in Latin forms the imperfect subjunctive in this. Here are a couple of sentences from chapter 34. If I look at the main verb, I see abamus here, which tells me I've got a secondary tense verb. We were hurrying in order that we might help you. Can you see that I have an infinitive here plus a personal ending? I could translate it the long way, in order that we might help you, or I could translate in order to help you, or I could say we were hurrying to help you. So an infinitive in English is a purpose clause in Latin. Festinemus. Ooh, this looks like a present tense verb. It happens to be a hortatory subjunctive, but it's still present tense, which makes it a primary verb. So in the purpose clause after ne, I need to use a present subjunctive. Let us hurry in order that we may not arrive late. Let us hurry lest we arrive late are two ways to translate a negative purpose clause. But really, really watch out, because when you translate from English into Latin, an infinitive is not always an infinitive. So for example, you ought to write sentences. Sounds like debeo plus an infinitive, because that's how I say ought. But you study Latin to write sentences really means you study Latin in order to write sentences, or in order that you may write sentences. And that would be a purpose clause in Latin. Sententias scribere debes, you ought to write sentences. Latine studes ut sententias scribas. You are studying, plus the dative, Latin to write sentences, or in order that you may write sentences, or in order to write sentences. Here are a couple of famous Latin sentences containing purpose clauses. See if you can figure out what at least one of them says. Copy, check any other vocabulary. I think I've given you all the vocab that you need, but you do have to think about these sentences. So practice saying them out loud and thinking about them, and see if you can figure out what one or the other says. Wale!